Historians have debated whether a unified progressive reform movement existed during the decades surrounding the turn of the 20th century. While some scholars have doubted the development of a cohesive progressive project, others have argued that while progressive era reformers did not march in lockstep, they did draw from a common reform discourse that connected their separate agendas in spirit if not in kind. Despite these scholarly debates, historians of education have reached a consensus on the central importance of the progressive era and the educational reformers who shaped it during the early 20th century. This is not to say that historians of education do not disagree. In fact, they disagree intensely on the legacy of progressive educational experiments. Philosophical foundations. The progressive education movement was an integral part of the early 20th century reform impulse directed toward the reconstruction of American democracy through social as well as cultural uplift. When done correctly, these reformers contended education promised to ease the tensions created by the immense social, economic and political turmoil wrought by the forces of modernity characteristics of America. In short, the altered landscape of American life, progressive reformers believed, provided the school with a new opportunity, indeed a new responsibility to play a leading role in preparing American citizens for active civic participation in a democratic society. John Dewey, who would later be remembered as the father of progressive education, was the most eloquent and arguably most influential figure in educational progressivism. A noted philosopher, psychologist and educational reformer, Dewey graduated from the University of Vermont in 1879, taught high school briefly and then earned his doctorate in philosophy at the newly formed Johns Hopkins University in 1884. Dewey taught at the University of Michigan from 1884 to 1888, the University of Minnesota from 1888 to 1889, again at Michigan from 1889 to 1894, then at the University of Chicago from 1894 to 1904, and finally at Columbia University from 1904 until his retirement in 1931. During his long and distinguished career, Dewey generated over 1,000 books and articles on topics ranging from politics to art. For all his scholarly eclecticism, however, none of his work ever strayed too far from his primary intellectual interest, education. Through such works as The School and Society, 1899, The Child and the Curriculum, 1902, and Democracy and Education, 1916, Dewey articulated a unique, indeed a revolutionary reformulation of educational theory and practice based upon the core relationship he believed existed between democratic life and education. Namely, Dewey's vision for the school was inextricably tied to his larger vision of the good society, wherein education, as a deliberately conducted practice of investigation, of problem solving and of both personal and community growth, was the wellspring of democracy itself. Because each classroom represented a microcosm of human relationships that constituted the larger community, Dewey believed that the school as a little democracy could create a more lovely society. Dewey's emphasis on the importance of democratic relationships in the classroom setting necessarily shifted the focus of educational theory from the institution of the school to the needs of the school students. This dramatic change in American pedagogy, however, was not alone the work of John Dewey. To be sure, Dewey's attraction to child-centered educational practices was shared by other progressive educators and researchers such as Ella Flagg Young, 1845 to 1918, Dewey's colleague and kindred spirit at the University of Chicago, and Granville Stanley Hall, 1844 to 1924, the iconoclastic Clark University psychologist and avowed leader of the child study movement, who collectively derived their understanding of child-centeredness from reading and studying a diverse array of 19th and 20th century European and American philosophical schools. In general, the received philosophical traditions employed by Dewey and his fellow progressives at once defied childhood and advanced ideas of social and intellectual interdependence. First, in the writings about childhood, Frenchman Jean-Jacques Rousseau (1712 to 1778) emphasized its organic and natural dimensions, while English literary romantics such as William Wordsworth (1770 to 1850) and William Blake (1757 to 1827) celebrated its innate purity and piety, a characterization later shared by American transcendentalist philosophers Ralph Waldo Emerson (1803 to 1882) and Henry David Thoreau (1817 to 1862). For these thinkers, childhood was a period of innocence, goodness and piety that was in every way morally superior to the polluted lives led by most adults. Second, and more important, Dewey and his fellow educational progressives drew from the work of German philosopher Friedrich Froebel (1782 to 1852) and Swiss educator Johann Pestalozzi (1746 to 1827). Froebel and Pestalozzi were among the first to articulate the process of educating the whole child, wherein learning moved beyond the subject matter and ultimately rested upon the needs and interests of the child. Tending to both the pupil's head and heart, they believed was the real business of schooling, and they searched for an empirical and rational science of education that would incorporate these foundational principles. Froebel drew upon the garden metaphor of cultivating young children towards maturity, and he provided the European foundations for the late 19th century kindergarten movement in the United States. Similarly, Pestalozzi popularized the pedagogical method of object teaching, wherein a teacher began with an object related to the child's world in order to initiate the child into the world of the educator. Pedagogical Progressivism. The pedagogical progressives who embraced this child-centered pedagogy favored education built upon an experience-based curriculum developed by both students and teachers. Teachers played a special role in the progressive formulation for education as they merged their deep knowledge of and affection for children with the intellectual demands of the subject matter. Contrary to his detractors then and now, Dewey, while admittedly anti-authoritarian, did not take child-centered curriculum and pedagogy to mean the complete abandonment of traditional subject matter or instructional guidance and control. In fact, Dewey criticized derivations of those theories that treated education as a mere source of amusement or as a justification for rote vocationalism. Rather, stirred by his desire to reaffirm American democracy, Dewey's time and resource exhaustive educational program depended on close student-teacher interactions that, Dewey argued, requiring nothing less than the utter reorganization of traditional subject matter. Although the practice of pure Deweyism was rare, his educational ideas were implemented in private and public school systems alike. During his time as head of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Chicago, which also included the fields of psychology and pedagogy, Dewey and his wife Alice established a university laboratory school, an institutional center for educational experimentation. The lab school sought to make experience and hands-on learning the heart of the educational enterprise, and Dewey carved out a special place for teachers. Dewey was interested in obtaining psychological insight into the child's individual capacities and interests. Education was ultimately about growth, Dewey argued, and the school played a crucial role in creating an environment that was responsive to the child's interests and needs and would allow the child to flourish. Similarly, Colonel Francis W. Parker, a contemporary of Dewey and devout Emersonian, embraced an abiding respect for the beauty and wonder of nature, privileged the happiness of the individual over all else, and linked education and experience in pedagogical practice. During his time as superintendent of schools in Quincy, Massachusetts, and later as the head of the Cook County Normal School in Chicago, Parker rejected discipline, authority, regimentation, and traditional pedagogical techniques and emphasized warmth, spontaneity, and the joy of learning. Both Dewey and Parker believed in learning by doing, arguing that genuine delight rather than drudgery should be the byproduct of manual work. By linking the home and school and viewing both as integral parts of a larger community, progressive educators sought to create an educational environment wherein children could see that the hands-on work they did had some bearing on society. While progressive education has most often been associated with private independent schools such as Dewey's Laboratory School, Margaret Numberg's Walden School, and Lincoln School of Teachers College, progressive ideas were also implemented in large school systems, the most well known being those in Winnetka, Illinois, and Gary, Indiana. Located some 20 miles north of Chicago on its affluent North Shore, the Winnetka schools, under the leadership of Superintendent Carlent Washburn, rejected traditional classroom practice in favor of individualized instruction that let children learn at their own pace. Washburn and his staff in the Winnetka schools believed that all children had a right to be happy and live natural and full lives, and they yoked the needs of the individual to those of the community. Administrative Progressivism. While Dewey was the most well-known and influential progressive educator and philosopher, he by no means represented all that progressive education ultimately became. In the whirlwind of turn-of-the-century educational reform, the idea of educational progressivism took on multiple and often contradictory definitions. Thus, at the same time, the Dewey and his followers rejected traditional methods of instruction and developed a new education based on the interests and needs of the child. A new cadre of professionally trained school administrators likewise justified their own reforms in the name of progressive education. Administrative progressives shared Dewey's distaste for 19th century education, but they differed markedly with Dewey in their prescription for its reform. Administrative progressives wanted to overthrow bookish and rigid schooling by creating what they believed to be more useful, efficient, and centralized systems of public education based on vertically integrated bureaucracies, curricular differentiation, and mass testing. Professional school administrators relied on managerial expertise in order to efficiently supervise increasingly large public school systems. Significantly, the new administrators, borrowing the language and practice of efficiency experts like Frederick W. Taylor, attempted to rationalize disparate school districts within one hierarchically arranged system of primary, middle, and high school institutions. Powerful school boards, often comprising elite business and civic leaders, hired professionally trained school superintendents to implement policies and to oversee the day-to-day operations of these vast educational systems. The superintendent, often a male, distanced himself from the mostly female corps of teachers, not to mention the students the school was intended to serve. In the name of efficiency, superintendents relied on scientific, if often sterile, personal management techniques which had been developed by and for private industry and imported to the school setting by way of business-friendly school boards and through graduate training at the newly developed schools of education. The school's turn towards bureaucratic efficiency directly shaped curricular construction. In particular, the idea of differentiation became a new watchword in administrative progressive circles, reflecting the burgeoning economic and status markers signified by the attainment of educational credentials. By differentiating the curriculum along academic and vocational tracks, school administrators sought to meet the needs of different classes and calibers of students and to more tightly couple educational training with educational outcomes. While administrators justified this curricular innovation, which was most often used in the high schools, on the basis of equal opportunity for all students based on ability, it reflected a larger, more significant shift in the basic aims and objectives of American education. Where the school once provided intellectual and moral training in the face of an increasingly diverse student population, progressive administrators took their chief professional administrative responsibility to be the preparation of students for their future lives as workers in the American labor force. For many contemporary observers, however, circular differentiation was little more than a euphemism for social control, which critics suggested curtailed liberal education in order to meet the labor demands of America's budding industrial society. While this is a cynical view of the progressive administrative drive, there is much justification for it. Founded in 1906 by a committee of educators and business and industrial leaders, the National Society for the Promotion of Industrial Education (NSPIE) helped organize vocational educational programs in high schools around the country during the first several decades of the 20th century. Vocational education, which critics conveniently, if incorrectly, linked to progressive education, was expressly designed to train students for immediate employment following and often in lieu of graduation. On the other hand, administrative progressives justified the rise of vocational tracks by pointing to the relatively minuscule college-going population and by proclaiming it as an effective means of assimilating newly arrived immigrants into the American life and institutions. The interest in the efficient management of bureaucratic school systems and students was strengthened further by developments in educational psychology and intelligence testing. Among the 20th century's prominent educational psychologists, E. L. Thorndike (1874 to 1949), who studied under William James at Harvard and taught at Columbia University's Teachers College during Dewey's tenure, was undoubtedly the most influential. Presaging the rise of post-World War I mass intelligence testing by relying on intelligence tests in his own studies as early as 1903, Thorndike's research advanced a narrowly focused stimulus-response definition of intelligence that justified the spread of worker training through vocational education. At the same time, his mechanistic conception of intelligence corrupted Dewey's own ideas about the organic connection between thinking and doing. Let us now see about the life adjustment progressivism. Yet the internal contradictions and ideological inconsistencies of the pedagogical and administrative progressives in many ways forecast the demise of the progressive education movement. A system of education that championed both child-centeredness and individuated attention on one hand and the explicit curricular differentiation through intelligence testing on the other was perhaps destined to collapse. And with the introduction of life adjustment education during the 1940s and 50s, the progressive education movement did just that. Life adjustment education emerged on the scene during the 1940s and witnessed its heyday during the early days of Cold War. The cause of life adjustment education was advanced by leaders of the vocational education movement like Charles Prosser, who helped pass the monumental 1917 Smith-Hughes National Vocational Education Act, who believed that the school's main function should be to prepare students for the work world. To this end, the life adjusters borrowed generously from the pedagogical and administrative progressive lexicon by advocating that schools should test and track students at the same time that they should improve students' physical and emotional well-being. Ultimately, the United States Office of Education's Commission on Life Adjustment Education for Youth co-opted the mantle of progressive education. Using commission reports published in 1951 and 1954 as its blueprint for action, the life adjustment movement succeeded in instituting its therapeutic curricula geared toward the development of personal hygiene, sociability and personality and industrious habits of mind at thousands of schools around the country. Critics denounced the public schools' shift toward an overtly custodial function as both anti-American, anti-intellectual and ironically anti-democratic. In the shadow of Joseph McCarthy's communist witch hunt, the progressive sponsorship of international understanding through education, the perceived penchant for feel-good classroom instruction and the alleged liberal political orientation of progressive educators cut against the grain of 1950s conservative America. The alleged anti-intellectualism of adjustment pedagogy, however, fueled even more criticism. Among others, the historian Arthur Bester led the charge against life adjustment's anti-intellectualism. In his Educational Wastelands 1953 and the Restoration of Learning 1955, Bester argued that life adjustment's emphasis on vocational instruction and life management skills marginalized the place of traditional core subjects. In this traditional view, most similar to the 19th century concept of education as mental discipline, Bester was joined by other neo-traditionalist educational luminaries including Robert Maynard Hutchins, president of the University of Chicago and advocate of the Great Books curriculum, and James Bryan Conant, the highly respected and influential president of Harvard University. All three men agreed on the fundamental aimlessness and futility of life adjustment education in particular and American high school education in general. Progressive education did not entirely disappear, however. The fundamental tenets of progressive education's pedagogical and administrative functions continue to inform contemporary educational debates. What is the relationship between education and democratic citizenship between teachers and students? Are school districts too large? To what extent is the school responsible for the emotional as well as intellectual development of its pupils? Do achievement tests provide valid and reliable measures of student learning? Is the core curriculum sacrosanct or amenable to change? These are just some of the questions progressive educators attempted to ask and answer, and they are questions that educators still wrestle with at the beginning of 21st century. In this lesson, we have seen on philosophical foundations of progressive thought in education, pedagogical progressivism, administrative progressivism, and life adjustment progressivism. Thank you.